The first shell took the tree line apart 40 meters behind Corporal Reya Voss, and the second one walked closer, and by the third, she had stopped counting and started running. Mud sucked at her boots. Ahead of her, what was left of Talon Company was folding backward through the reeds of the Greywater Delta in the ragged, ugly shape retreats always took. Not a line, just a smear of bodies moving away from the noise. Somewhere to her left, a support strut screamed as an Osran trooper dragged it through the muck by its harness webbing, using it as a sled for a soldier who could no longer walk. Voss's rifle stock was slick with river water. Her earpiece was a wall of static and half-words. A plasma round took the reeds apart 6 meters to her right, close enough that the heat of it licked across her cheek and left her ears ringing under the static. She went down on instinct, came up moving, and nearly ran into Private Sardo Kell, 17 years old and 2 months in country, sitting stunned in the mud with blood sheeting down one side of his face from a scalp wound that looked worse than it was. She hauled him up by the webbing on his chest rig, shoved him forward into the retreat's current, and did not slow down to see if he found his feet, because 2 more Osran troopers were already closing to take his weight, because that was how the column survived, everyone catching the next person, no one stopping long enough to be caught themselves. Behind her, the Ashkarite armor's engines had found a new pitch, climbing, and somewhere off to the north, a heavier gun opened up that made the ground itself shudder underfoot. Fall back to the ridge, all units, negative on holding the ford. That was Warmother Thren Kesala's voice, flattened by distance and interference into something almost mechanical. Voss had heard that voice give orders across 4 campaigns now, and she had never once heard it waver, which was exactly why the next 4 words landed like a blow. Triage cutoff in effect. Every human in Talon Company knew what that meant. Every Osran in the company knew it better, because it was their doctrine, inherited from 100 generations of matriarchal war councils who had learned. At some terrible cost, Voss had never been told the full story of, that a column moving to save 1 dying soldier was a column that lost 10 more. The conquered did not sentimentalize the wounded. It counted them, weighed the cost of retrieval against the cost of delay, and when the math failed, it left them where they fell and mourned them properly later, with names read aloud and medals struck. It was, Voss had been told more than once by officers who meant it kindly, the humane way to run a war. Nobody bled out slowly from false hope. She kept moving with the rest of the company for 11 more strides. Then her earpiece caught a fragment that stopped her cold. Wayfinder Draeth, last position the second ford, no response on comm, biosign ping intermittent, mark her unsalvageable, repeat, unsalvageable, do not divert. Voss's boots planted in the mud like roots. Around her the retreat kept flowing, indifferent, a river finding its own way past a stone. Private Anwin Cho grabbed her sleeve without breaking stride. Voss, move. Draeth's down at the second ford. I heard it same as you, Warmother said unsalvageable. Cho's face was streaked with delta mud and something darker that wasn't mud. That means unsalvageable, Ray. That's not a suggestion. It's math, Voss said. It's not her body they measured, it's the delay. Same thing when you're the one lying in the reeds. Voss looked south, toward the ford, where the tree line had gone from screaming to something worse. Silence, broken by the low mechanical cough of Ashkarite armor finding its rhythm again after the first barrage. 3 weeks ago, on a ridge 40 kilometers from here, this same delta had nearly taken 11 soldiers, and Voss had watched a Wayfinder walk them out of it 1 careful step at a time. She remembered it in pieces, the way fear preserved things, the ridge slick with old rain, the company strung out single file behind Draeth's narrow shoulders, a Dominion patrol close enough on the far slope that she could hear them arguing over channel discipline, sharp and careless. The way soldiers argued when they didn't yet know the ground 10 meters from them was about to decide who lived. Draeth had not spoken above a whisper the entire crossing. She had simply raised a hand twice, and the whole line had stopped dead both times, and both times something had clicked faintly under the boot of the trooper directly behind her. A pressure plate not quite triggered, a mechanism that had accepted a partial weight, and by some mercy of engineering tolerance, not gone the rest of the way. Draeth had knelt over each one afterward, disarmed them by hand with a set of picks no wider than sewing needles, her breath the only sound on the ridge, and had not once asked anyone to thank her for it, because in her world that request would have made no sense. A Wayfinder did the walking, the company did the surviving, and the ledger was understood to balance itself without comment. It hadn't balanced, though. Not really. Voss remembered Cho sitting against a boulder at the ridge's far end afterward, hands shaking too hard to hold her canteen, crying in the particular silent, furious way of someone who had spent the whole crossing, convinced she was about to watch a friend die and had no acceptable way to say so out loud, because Wayfinders were not supposed to be friends officially. They were assets. Voss had sat with her a long time that evening and neither of them had said much, and neither of them had needed to. Draeth had gotten 11 soldiers, human and Osran both, off that ridge alive, and she had done it without being asked twice, and without being thanked properly, because Wayfinders were not the kind of soldier command thanked properly. They were the kind you sent first and mourned briefly. "I'm going back," Voss said. Cho's grip tightened. "That's a direct order you'd be breaking." "I know what it is. They'll court-martial you, best case." "Then it'll be a fast trial," Voss said, and pulled her arm free and turned south into the noise everyone else was running from. She did not look back to see Cho's face. She didn't have to. She already knew what it would say, not fury, not really. Something closer to grief for a friend who had just made herself a casualty statistic on top of a casualty statistic. That was fine. Voss had made peace with being misunderstood by people who loved her before. She had never once made peace with leaving someone in the mud who had bought her life with her own blood and never once asked for anything back. The delta closed around her in green-black shadow, reeds taller than her head, the ground gone soft and treacherous under 6 inches of standing water. Overhead, an Ashkarite scout drone traced a slow ellipse against the darkening sky, its rotor whine a thin metallic thread stitched through the bigger noise of the retreating column and the guns behind it. Voss dropped into a crouch on instinct, counted the drone's pass, and moved again the second its angle turned away from her. The second ford was 400 meters south. It felt like 4,000. Her lungs burned with delta air, thick and mineral-smelling, and her boots kept finding the soft spots where the marsh wanted to swallow a leg to the knee. Twice, she heard voices in a language that wasn't Osran and wasn't Terran, clipped, guttural Ashkarite battle cant, close enough that she went still in the reeds with her heart slamming, and waited a full 90 seconds before she trusted herself to move again. She found Saevi Draeth exactly where the last biosign ping had placed her, half in the water at the ford's edge, one wing strut folded at an angle no healthy Osran body allowed, a dark stain spreading slow and silver blue through the water around her ribs. Draeth's kind didn't bleed red. It was one of the first things that had struck Voss, months ago, watching a field medic work, that silver-blue color, cooling almost to black where it pooled, looking less like a wound and more like something spilled from a broken instrument. "Draeth." Voss dropped to her knees in the water beside her, hands already moving, checking the wing strut, checking the chest for the telltale shallow flutter of a collapsed air sac. "Draeth, can you hear me?" The Osran's eyes opened, pale gold, slitted, unfocused for a long, terrible second before they found Voss's face and something in them sharpened. "Voss," her voice was a thread, "you should not be here." "Yeah, I've heard that twice already today." Order was given, unsalvageable. Draeth's hand, 3-fingered, cool, closed weakly around Voss's wrist. "Go while you still can." "Cutoffs for commands math," Voss said. working her hands under the Osran's shoulders, feeling for the least damaged way to lift her. "Not for me. You will be tried." "I'll show up for it," Voss said, and got her arms under Draeth's back and knees and lifted, and the wounded woman's cry, sharp, cut off almost immediately by discipline that had survived even this, was the worst sound Voss had heard all day, worse than the shelling, worse than the drone. She adjusted her grip, took the weight fully against her chest, and started moving. Behind them, north, the last of Talon Company's retreat noise was fading into the marsh. Ahead, and to the east, where the Amber Line's extraction ridge waited with a hard cutoff of its own, the sky was already beginning to purple toward evening. Between here and there lay 4 kilometers of delta that belonged, as of this hour, to nobody, not truly conquered ground anymore, not yet Ashkarite held, just a strip of contested mud and reed and old minefield that the war hadn't finished deciding about. Voss adjusted Draeth's weight one more time, felt the Osran's ragged breath against her collarbone, and started walking into it. Draeth was not a small woman. Osran frames ran taller than human ones on average, built long through the torso to house the paired air sacs that let their voices carry across open ground, and their lungs work at altitudes that would leave a human gasping. Carrying her was carrying a person and a half, dead weight sagging with every uneven step, and within the first 300 meters Voss's shoulders had gone from burning to numb to something past numb that she didn't have a word for. She kept moving anyway. She had learned a long time ago, in a training yard that felt like another lifetime, that the body would keep doing the thing long after it had run out of good reasons too, if you simply refused to negotiate with it. The ford gave way to a stretch of half-drowned scrub, and then to the black standing water of what the company's maps called the Long Reach, the delta's deepest channel, chest-high on a human, higher than that in the middle. Voss stood at its edge with Draeth's weight sagging against her, and did the math her body didn't want to hear. There was no way around it without adding 2 kilometers and an hour she didn't have, and there was no way through it without submerging a wounded woman whose lungs already weren't working right. "Put me down," Draeth said, eyes half open, voice steadier than it had any right to be. "I will not survive the crossing carried like this. Leave me on the bank. Send conquered medics when the line advances." "The line's not advancing tonight." "Then leave me on the bank and go." "No." "Voss." Something in Draeth's tone shifted, sharpened, not pleading. Wayfinders didn't plead. Voss had noticed that about her months ago, the particular flat dignity with which her caste accepted the things done to them. "I am a Wayfinder. Do you understand what that means truly? I was bred for this. Trained from the creche to walk into the ground nobody else will walk into, and to be written off cleanly when the ground finishes me. It is not tragedy, it is function. You are wasting your one body, on a cost the conquered already accepted." Voss knelt at the water's edge, and set her down as gently as the terrain allowed. Not to leave her. Draeth's face flickered with something that might have been hope and might have been resignation. But to strip off her own field pack and lash it, with the length of paracord she carried for exactly this kind of improvisation, into a crude float harness around the wounded strut, buying the fractured wing bone some support against the current. "You know what?" Voss said, working the knots, not looking up. 3 weeks ago you walked point through a minefield you'd never seen at night, with Dominion troops close enough to smell, and got 11 of us home. I didn't hear anyone call that function. I heard Cho crying about it for 2 days because she thought you were going to die doing it, and she never got to say thank you." Draeth was quiet for a moment. In the deepening dusk her pale eyes tracked Voss's hands. "That is a different kind of math," she said finally, "than the one command uses." "Yeah." Voss finished the last knot and gathered her back up, feeling the strut's support hold, feeling the water close cold around her boots as she stepped in. "It's mine." The crossing took 11 minutes that felt like an hour. The current pulled hard at Voss's knees, then her hips, then, at the channel's center, her ribs, and she felt the cold press of the water climb toward Draeth's wound and heard the Osran's breath catch and go shallow and fought the urge to hurry, because hurrying was how people drowned each other in currents like this. She planted each step before committing her weight to it, feeling for the soft bottom that could open into a hole without warning, and somewhere in the middle of the channel Draeth's good hand found the collar of Voss's jacket and gripped it. Not for support, Voss understood after a moment, but because the Osran's inner ear, tuned to distances and echoes no human sense could parse, had caught something on the far bank that her failing eyes couldn't confirm. Drone, Draeth breathed, west bank low. Voss froze mid-step, water to her ribs, and listened and heard nothing, and trusted the woman in her arms anyway, because a Wayfinder's ears had kept 11 soldiers alive once already. 15 seconds. 20. Then, faint, carried on the wind shift Draeth's biology had caught before Voss's ever could the thin whine of rotors, sweeping, moving away north along the tree line. Clear, Draeth murmured, and her grip on Voss's collar loosened, and Voss let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding and finished the crossing. At the command post on the Amber Line, 6 kilometers east and a war away from the Delta's reeds, War Mother Thren Kessala stood over a tactical table lit in the cool blue glow of a conquered field display, and watched a single biosign marker flicker at the edge of detection range, moving southeast, away from the retreat corridor, toward Ashkarite-held ground. "That's Voss," said her aide, a young Osran communications officer named Farron, reading the same marker. "Corporal Reya Voss. Talon Company confirms her absent from the withdrawal count." "I gave a triage cutoff." "Yes, War Mother. I did not give an order for a human corporal to go and die keeping company with a Wayfinder I had already written off." Farron said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Kessala had commanded for 11 campaigns. She had built her reputation and the trust of the matriarchal war council above her on precisely this doctrine, the cold, defensible math of triage, applied without exception because exceptions were how you lost battalions instead of individuals. She had signed off on cutoffs before. She would sign off on them again. It was not cruelty. It was arithmetic wearing a uniform. And yet, she thought, unbidden, of a report she had read 11 years ago as a junior officer, about the last surviving Wayfinder of a border skirmish on Havern's Reach's sister world, a woman who had guided a company through terrain no scan could map and had then been left, per doctrine, when the retrieval cost outweighed the tactical value. Kessala had been young enough then, junior enough, to read that report and feel something catch in her chest that she had not had the vocabulary or the standing to name. A discomfort she remembered specifically, sitting at a briefing table in a command tent much like this one, looking at a photograph of a woman she had never met and would never meet, and thinking, only for a moment before duty reasserted itself, someone should have gone back for her. She had filed the thought away the way junior officers learned to file away every thought that didn't serve the mission in front of them, and had gone on in the years since to sign her own name to cut off orders with a steadiness she had been rather proud of, until tonight. The report had used the word unsalvageable. Kessala had used that same word an hour ago without hesitating, and it had not occurred to her, not once in the saying of it, that Draeth was a person who had done exactly that kind of impossible, uncounted work 3 weeks prior, and had never once been formally credited for it, because crediting a Wayfinder properly required someone to stop and notice. She wondered, standing over the tactical table with that old photograph surfacing unbidden after 11 years of practice forgetting, how many times in her career she had been the officer who didn't stop, and how much of her own composure had been built, quietly, on never counting. "Time to the extraction window's hard close," she asked. 2 hours 9 minutes, War Mother. "Keep the marker up. If it moves off vector toward Dominion lines, I want to know before it happens, not after." A second officer, Senior Logistics Coordinator Vale Oren, had crossed the tent while they spoke, drawn by the tension in Farron's voice, and now stood at Kesala's shoulder studying the same flickering marker with an expression that had already made up its mind. War Mother, with respect, if you commit resources to the Western Gate for a triaged casualty before confirmation, you are setting a precedent the War Council will ask about by name. Every future cutoff order will be measured against tonight's exception. I am aware of that, Orin. Then you are aware the doctrine exists precisely to prevent commanders from making decisions on the strength of one soldier's loyalty instead of the campaign's arithmetic. I wrote the arithmetic, Kesala said, not unkindly, though something in her voice had gone flat and final in a way Orin had clearly not expected from her. I am permitted to notice, once in 11 campaigns, when it has stopped serving the thing it was built to protect. Orin held her gaze a moment longer, then inclined her head, not agreement, but the particular formal concession an Osran officer gave a superior whose mind was made, and whose rank made further argument pointless, and withdrew to the tent's far side without another word. And if Corporal Voss makes it back inside the window, carrying a triaged casualty? Kesala did not answer immediately. Above her, through the command tent's open flap, the last gray light was draining out of a sky the color of a bruise, and somewhere out in that dying light, a corporal from a species the Conquered had allied with for barely 2 decades was wading through contested marsh on the strength of a decision Kesala's own doctrine said she had no business making. Then we will discuss, Kesala said finally, what the doctrine failed to account for. Voss came up out of the long reach's far bank into a stand of blackened stumps, the scorched remains of a tree line some earlier barrage had already claimed, and set Draeth down against the largest of them to catch her own breath, chest heaving, arms trembling with a fine, uncontrollable shake that had nothing to do with the cold. Draeth's eyes were open, tracking her. "You are hurt," the Osran said, not a question. "I'm fine." "Your shoulder, the left one, you favor it." Voss glanced down. Somewhere in the crossing, a submerged branch or a stone she'd never seen had opened a shallow gash along her upper arm, blood, red, ordinary, human red soaking through the sleeve. She hadn't even felt it happen. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing. It is a data point." Draeth's voice had gone dry, almost wry, an odd register for a woman with a collapsed lung strut and silver-blue blood pooling under her ribs. "You should learn to report your own condition as honestly as you report mine." "Careful," Voss said, tearing a strip from the hem of her undershirt one-handed and knotting it above the gash. "That's almost a joke. Command's gonna dock you for morale infractions." Something that might have been the ghost of a laugh moved through Draeth's chest and turned, halfway, into a wet cough that left flecks of silver blue at the corner of her mouth. Voss's own half-formed humor died. She finished the knot, checked Draeth's wingstrut splint again, and looked east, toward where the amber line waited behind 3 more kilometers of ground that belonged to no one. "How much farther can your ears reach?" she asked, "before we walk into something neither of us can hear coming." Draeth was quiet a moment, gathering breath, gathering whatever reserve a body that had been bleeding for 2 hours had left to give. "Give me your hand," she said. Voss knelt and offered it. Draeth pressed Voss's palm flat against her own sternum, over the working half of her chest, over the strange double rhythm of an Osran heartbeat that Voss had never felt before and would never forget after, not 1 pulse but 2, offset, weaving together like a knot tying itself. "This is failing," Draeth said, matter of fact, without self-pity, the same flat dignity she'd shown at the ford. "Not tonight. But soon, if the bleeding does not stop, and it will not stop on its own, my hearing will go before my heart does. The sacs that carry sound are the same ones that are drowning. I have perhaps 1 more hour of being useful to you, as anything other than wait. Then we use the hour." Draeth studied her, a long look, gold eyes steady despite everything her body was failing to be steady about. "Why?" she said. "Truly. Not the ridge, not the debt. Why does one human corporal choose a court-martial and a knight in contested ground over a triage number she was never asked to argue with?" Voss thought about it while she checked her rifle's action, more from habit than doubt, and settled the strap back over her good shoulder. "Because the number's not wrong," she said finally. "The math checks out. Send a whole company back for one soldier and maybe you lose the company. I get why the rule exists. But the rule was built to cover a decision made by somebody who's never met you. Cho has. Half the wing that walked off that ridge alive because of you has. I have." She got an arm back under Draeth's shoulders, gentler this time, mindful of the strut. "The rule doesn't get to make the decision for the people who actually know what you're worth, just the ones who don't." Draeth said nothing to that for several seconds, and when she spoke again her voice had gone rougher, and Voss understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had just carried a person 1.5 kilometers through open water, that she was hearing something Saevi Draeth had perhaps never said to another living soul. "Wayfinders are told from the creche that no one will ever say that to us. That we exist to be spent, and that being spent well is the whole of the honor available to us." A breath, ragged. I did not expect to hear it contradicted by a species that has known us for 20 years, from a soldier I have known for 4 months. "Well," Voss got her braced, got her lifted, felt the strain settle back into shoulders that had already given everything they had and found, somehow, a little more. "Guess today's full of surprises." The stumps gave way to open scrub, and open scrub was the worst kind of ground for 2 people running out of daylight and cover in equal measure. Voss moved along the tree line's ragged eastern edge, where the shadows still pooled deep. Draeth's weight a slow-burning fire across her shoulders, every muscle in her back screaming a protest she had stopped listening to somewhere back at the long reach. It was Draeth, drifting in and out of a consciousness that came and went now in shorter and shorter waves, who caught the first warning. "Stop!" The word came out thick, half-slurred, but urgent enough that Voss obeyed instantly, dropping into the scrub's low cover. "Ground ahead. Wrong." "Wrong how?" "Disturbed, recently." Draeth's head lolled against Voss's shoulder, eyes struggling to focus. "Dominion lays field mines in a spiral pattern from a center anchor, a boulder, a stump, a marker post. I have read 6 of their fields in 3 campaigns. The grass ahead does not lie flat the way undisturbed grass lies flat." Voss looked and looked harder, and saw nothing that her eyes, trained for muzzle flashes and movement, and not for the subtle grain of disturbed versus undisturbed vegetation, could distinguish from ordinary scrub in the dying light. "I can't see it." "I cannot either, not with my eyes." Draeth's hand found Voss's jaw, turned her face gently east toward a low rise perhaps 80 meters distant where a single dead tree stood black against the purple sky. "That tree, anchor point. If this is their pattern, the safe lane runs along the tree line's shadow, 20 meters left of straight, then curves back at the halfway mark. I cannot promise it. I am guessing from a pattern I have seen, not a map I have read." "Good enough for me." "It should not be." Draeth's voice was fading, effort visibly costing her more than it should. "If I am wrong." "Then we'll have been wrong together," Voss said, and started walking the line the wounded woman in her arms had traced from memory and training, and a caste-bred instinct for reading ground that Voss would never fully understand. 20 meters left of straight. Boots placed with a care that made every stride take 3 times as long as it should have. Sweat cold on her spine despite the evening chill. Watching the grass for a sign she still couldn't read and trusting instead. The woman whose ears had already saved them once tonight. Halfway across, Draeth's hand tightened suddenly against her collar. "Curve, now, right 10 degrees." Voss adjusted without questioning it, and 3 steps later her boot came down on a patch of ground that gave, fractionally, wrong. A give she felt through the sole of her boot a half-second before some animal part of her brain screamed *stop, and she froze with her full weight already committed, heart slamming, and looked down at packed earth that looked, in the failing light, exactly like every other patch of packed earth around it. "Don't move your weight forward," Draeth breathed. "Roll it back. Slow." Voss rolled her weight back onto her rear foot with the terrible, controlled slowness of someone diffusing something with her own body, felt her boot lift clear, and stood there a moment in the open scrub with a wounded woman in her arms and her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. "That was the field," she said, when she could speak again. "That was the field." Draeth's eyes had drifted half shut again, the effort of that single act of focus visibly draining whatever reserve she'd scraped together. "We are past the worst of it now, I think." "You think?" "I am a Wayfinder, Corporal, not a prophet." A ghost of that dry humor again, fainter now, more expensive. "Walk where I told you, quickly. Before I am no longer certain of anything." They cleared the field's far edge 2 minutes later, Voss's legs shaking with an adrenaline crash that made the ground feel unsteady even once they were standing on solid earth again. And it was only then, glancing back at the innocent-looking stretch of scrub behind them, that she let herself understand fully what had almost happened, and did not stop walking, because stopping to feel it would cost time neither of them had. They had gone perhaps 300 meters past the minefield's far edge, into a stretch of low scrub broken by irrigation, ditches some pre-war farmer had cut, and the war had since abandoned, when the sky over the western tree line split white. A flare. Not a scout drone's running lights, not artillery. A hand-launched illumination round, tumbling up on a thin trail of smoke before it burst into a hard magnesium glare that turned the whole delta the color of old bone for 3 or 4 seconds, before it began its slow drift down on a parachute nobody had bothered to camouflage. Voss went down into the nearest ditch on reflex, dragging Draeth with her, folding herself over the wounded woman's body in the shallow water without thinking about it, the way she'd learned in a training yard years ago that a body was cover before it was ever anything else. The flare's light washed across the ditch's lip above them, close enough that she could see individual blades of scrub grass thrown into hard relief, and held, and did not go out. Somewhere beyond the ditch, engine noise. Not the whine of a scout drone's rotors, but something heavier, wheeled, grinding low and patient along what had to be a supply track Voss hadn't known was there. A Dominion light patrol vehicle, moving parallel to their line of march, close enough that, when its headlamps swept the scrub above the ditch's lip, she felt the light pass over her back like a physical weight. Beneath her, Draeth's whole body had gone rigid, and it took Voss a second in the strange bone-white light to understand why. The Osran's breath had caught into the beginning of a cough, the kind that had shaken loose flecks of silverblue twice already tonight, and she was fighting it with everything her failing chest had left, jaw locked, eyes screwed shut. One 3-fingered hand clawed into the mud at her side hard enough that Voss could see the tendon standing up along the back of it. "Don't," Voss breathed, barely more than shaped air, and pressed her palm flat over Draeth's sternum, not hard, just present, the way you'd steady someone standing too close to a ledge. "Not yet." "Almost past." The vehicle's engine note held steady, unhurried, a patrol on its ordinary loop and nothing more, and Voss counted the seconds by her own pulse, feeling Draeth's cough building and breaking and building again beneath her palm, a losing battle fought entirely in silence. The flare guttered, dimmed, finally died somewhere in the reeds behind them, and the vehicle's engine note began, at last, to fade east along the track, unhurried, indifferent, oblivious. The cough broke the instant the danger passed. A short, racking spasm Draeth muffled against her own shoulder, silver blue flecking the collar of her flight suit, her whole body shaking with the effort of having held it that long. "Sorry," she managed when she could speak. "I could not much longer." "You didn't have to." Voss pulled her back up out of the ditch's standing water, checking the dressing at her ribs by feel, finding it darker than it had been an hour ago. You held it exactly long enough. That's the only math that matters right now. Something that might have been a laugh, thin and exhausted, moved through Draeth's chest. You are very fond, she said, of telling me what the math is for someone who claims not to trust it. I don't trust their math, Voss said, getting an arm back under her. I'm allowed to have my own. The ruin appeared out of the dusk like something surfacing from water, a conquered relay tower, or what was left of one, its upper third sheared away by some earlier exchange of fire, its base still standing amid a scatter of fallen composite panels and dead cable. Voss angled toward it on instinct, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 4 campaigns. Any cover was better than open ground when full dark came down, and full dark was minutes away now, the last gray light bleeding out of the sky behind the western tree line. Inside, the tower's base offered a rough half-room, walls intact on 3 sides, roof gone, the floor littered with the wreckage of whatever comms equipment had once lived there. Voss lowered Draeth against the most solid wall with the careful economy of someone who had done this too many times to be gentle about anything but the necessary parts, and checked her over properly for the first time since the ford, the wing strut, swollen and hot under her fingers despite the cold, the wound at her ribs, sluggishly weeping that dark silver blue through a field dressing that had gone from white to black. Her pulse, that strange double rhythm, weaker now and faster, the body's last desperate arithmetic trying to compensate for blood it didn't have any more. You're crashing, Voss said quietly. It wasn't a question either. I know what my own body is doing, Corporal. How long? Draeth's eyes, half-lidded, found hers in the dark. Less time than the walk to your line will take, if I am honest with you, which I intend to be, since you have earned that much tonight if nothing else. Voss sat back on her heels, breathing hard, feeling something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the wet clothes clinging to her skin. Then we go faster. Voss, Draeth's hand found her wrist again, weaker this time, the grip of someone spending strength she didn't have to spare. Listen to me. Whatever happens between here and your line, you did not fail tonight. Do you understand that? A Wayfinder is trained to accept that the ground sometimes wins. It is not a defeat. It is the function completing itself. Stop saying that like it's supposed to make me feel better. It is not meant to make you feel better. It is meant to be true in case I am not able to say the next part. A breath, effortful, wet at the edges. The next part is this. In 11 years of service I have been left twice before tonight. Left by Osran command by my own people, because the doctrine is the doctrine and I was born into the caste that exists to test it. I told myself both times that it was fair, that it was function. I have never, not once, had someone come back for me who was not required to. Her grip tightened just slightly, all the strength she had left concentrated into that one small pressure. Whatever the number said tonight, Corporal, you made it wrong. I would like that recorded somewhere, if there is a somewhere left to record it in. Voss's throat had gone tight in a way she didn't have room for right now, not with the tower's roofless walls open to a sky that could bring a scout drone over at any second, not with Draeth's pulse fluttering thin and fast under her fingers. She swallowed it down the way she'd learned to swallow everything that couldn't be dealt with in the moment, and reached for her field kit instead. You can tell me yourself, she said, unwrapping the ruined dressing, working fast in the dark by feel more than sight. When we're both standing in front of whatever board convenes to yell at me for this, I want you upright and difficult when that happens. Not a name on a report. She packed the wound as best she could with what remained of her kit. Not enough. Nowhere near enough for what an Osran medic with real equipment could do, but enough, maybe, to slow the bleeding another hour, another 2, if the fates that governed contested ground on the Havern frontier were feeling generous. Draeth's breath had gone shallow and fast, her eyes drifting shut between words now. And Voss understood, with the flat clarity of exhaustion and fear working together, that whatever our Draeth had estimated back at the stumps had already started running out. Outside, faint, carried on the wind voices. Ashkarite battle cant, closer than anything they'd heard yet, moving along the tower's east side. Voss went still, one hand still pressed to Draeth's dressing, and listened to a Dominion patrol walk close enough to hear their boots. There were 3 of them, by the sound of it, heavy Ashkarite combat boots on the scattered composite panels outside the tower's ruin, a low exchange of that guttural battle cant, a beam of hard white light sweeping once across the gap where the tower's door had been and passing on without pausing. Voss had gone utterly still, one arm braced across Draeth's chest to hold her flat and silent, her own breath held so long her vision started to gray at the edges. Draeth's eyes had opened again, thin slits of gold in the dark, tracking the sound with the last of whatever focus she had left. Her lips moved, barely a whisper, angled toward Voss's ear. 3, 1 north corner, 2 moving south along the cable trench. They are not searching. Patrol route, not a hunt. You're sure? I am listening to it happen, Corporal. Yes. The light swept past a second time closer, and Voss felt Draeth's whole body tense under her arm, not from pain this time, from the effort of holding still against a wound that wanted her to gasp, to move, to do anything but lie silent on hard, broken concrete while enemy soldiers walked past close enough to spit on. Voss counted her own heartbeat, forced it slower than it wanted to go, and waited. The boots moved on. The voices faded, folding back into the general noise of a delta at night, wind through reeds, the distant cough of artillery somewhere to the north, the tick of cooling composite. Voss counted 2 full minutes before she let her breath go, slow, silent, and felt Draeth's tension bleed out of her at the same moment, replaced almost immediately by a shudder that ran the length of her wounded frame. Draeth. No answer. Voss's hand found her throat, found the pulse there, thin, fast, present, but faint in a way it hadn't been 10 minutes ago. Saevi, she hadn't used the given name before. It came out of her without permission, low and urgent in the dark. Stay with me. A long, terrible pause, then faint, I am here. We're moving now. The patrol moved on. We're not staying to find out if there's a 4th one. Voss was already gathering her up, arms shaking now with a fatigue that had gone past pain into something numb and mechanical, a body running on will alone because will was the only fuel left in the tank. Talk to me. Keep talking. Tell me anything. What's the creche like where Wayfinders train? It was a clumsy question. She knew it even as she asked it. But she needed the sound of Draeth's voice more than she needed the answer, needed proof that the woman in her arms was still a person choosing words, and not simply a weight cooling toward silence. Draeth, dragged back from wherever the edge of consciousness had been pulling her, managed a few broken sentences about gray dormitories and instructors who never used names, only designations, about the first time she had read a minefield correctly at age 9 and been told, not praised, only told, that she had done what she was built for. And Voss listened to all of it while she carried her out of the tower's ruin and back into the open dark, putting one foot in front of the other. Putting one foot in front of the other, putting one foot in front of the other. At the Amber Line's forward command post, the biosign marker on Kesala's tactical display had gone from a steady blip to an intermittent flicker, dropping in and out of resolution as whatever field equipment Voss carried strained against range and interference both. Signals degrading, Farron reported. Could be terrain, could be. Could be the second signature failing, Kesala finished. She had not moved from the table in over an hour, had not eaten the ration someone had set at her elbow, had not, if she was honest with herself, stopped watching that flickering marker since the moment it turned south toward the ford instead of joining the retreat. Time to window close. 51 minutes, Warmother. Distance to their marker from the perimeter, at current heading. Farron worked the display. If they hold this line, and if the marker is accurate, approximately 38 minutes, it is close. It is not close. It is exact, which is worse. Casala straightened, feeling 11 campaigns worth of doctrine sitting uneasily in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. Send a forward element to the perimeter's western gate. Full medical team, stretcher ready, Osron trauma kit specs for a Wayfinder's physiology. I want them standing at that gate the moment the window opens, not summoned after. War Mother, that will be noted. A resource commitment against a triaged casualty, made before confirmation of. I am aware of what it will be noted as, Farron. Casala's voice did not rise, but something in it had gone hard in a way the young officer had learned, over months of service under her, meant the conversation was finished. I gave the cutoff order. I am permitted to be wrong about it before the War Council tells me so. She did not move to the gate herself, not yet. There was a version of this night in which she stood at that western perimeter and watched a marker simply stop. Somewhere out in the dark between here and the tower ruin her scouts had flagged as contested ground 3 days ago, and she was not yet certain she had the right, as the officer whose order had put that marker in motion, to witness its failure up close. But she found herself, in the minutes that followed, checking the display more often than her duties strictly required, and she noted, with something that was not quite surprise and not quite shame, that some part of her, the part that had read a report 11 years ago about a Wayfinder left on a border world and had felt, even then, a discomfort she'd filed away rather than examined, was hoping, with an intensity that had no place in a War Mother's calculus, that the marker would keep moving. The ground between the relay tower and the amber line was not empty. Voss found that out the hard way, easing out of the scrub 200 meters past the ruin, when the tree line ahead resolved, in the last gray scrap of dusk, into the unmistakable geometry of a fortified position, sandbagged firing points, a low prefabricated shelter throwing a thin seam of light through a blackout curtain that hadn't been hung quite right, and spanning the drainage channel that cut across the only clear approach to the conquered line. The single intact span left standing in this stretch of delta, a Dominion forward outpost, dug in to hold the one crossing that mattered. She went aground in the reeds 30 meters out and lay there with Draeth's weight pressing her into the mud, cataloging what she could see. 2 sentries at the span's near end, rifles slung but alert, a third moving along the sandbag line on a slow, bored patrol loop. No way through. No way around, either. The channel ran high and fast in both directions as far as the darkness let her see, swollen with runoff from somewhere upstream, and she had already learned tonight exactly what that current could do to a person carrying dead weight. Draeth, she kept her voice below a breath, lips against the Osron's ear. I need you awake. There's an outpost on the only bridge. I don't have a way past it. It took a long moment for Draeth to surface, and when she did her eyes opened only partway glassy, the effort of focusing visibly costing more than it had at the ford, more than it had at the minefield. Bridge, she repeated slow, like she was translating the word from somewhere farther away than English or Osron. Conquered engineers built this crossing before the front moved. There will be a service culvert beneath the span, for cable runs drainage. Her hand found Voss's wrist, gripping weakly. Downstream side. Hatch will be small. You will not be able to carry me through it upright. Then I won't carry you upright. Voss. Save it which side? Draeth's focus wavered, sharpened, wavered again. Left, your left, facing the channel. Below the waterline unless the runoff has dropped. It will be dark. It will be narrow. If it is flooded higher than I remember, we will drown in a pipe instead of a delta, and I would like you to know that I consider that a worse death, purely on principle. Noted, Voss breathed and started moving. She went down into the channel's bank on her belly, easing Draeth ahead of her rather than beneath her, feeling along the cold concrete face for the hatch the wounded woman had promised was there, praying to nothing in particular that the sentries 30 meters upstream stayed bored. Her fingers found the recessed lip of it on the third pass, half silted, and she worked it open with both hands while holding Draeth's weight against her hip with the last coordinated strength her body had left. And the hinge shrieked once, a thin metallic complaint that seemed, in the dead quiet dusk, loud enough to wake the whole delta. She froze. Upstream, the bored sentry's footsteps paused. 6 seconds, 10, 15. The footsteps resumed their loop, unhurried, and Voss let out a breath she'd been holding so long her vision had started to tunnel, and eased the hatch the rest of the way, slow, silent, and pushed Draeth ahead of her into a culvert barely wide enough for a human shoulder, black water running knee-deep along its bottom, the darkness inside total and close enough to taste. The crossing took 4 minutes on her hands and knees, dragging Draeth by the harness webbing with one hand, and feeling her way along slick concrete with the other, her skull cracking twice against a low seam in the pipe hard enough to see sparks behind her eyes, Draeth's breath beside her going shorter and shorter. A thin, panicked catch to it now that hadn't been there before, not fear of the enemy, Voss understood distantly, but the simple animal claustrophobia of a body already starved for air being folded into a space with none to spare. She kept one hand on Draeth's shoulder the whole way, not for guidance, but because she'd learned, in 4 hours of carrying this woman across contested ground, that a hand held steady mattered more than any words she could offer in a space too tight for either of them to raise their voice. They came up out of the culvert's far mouth into open air and full dark, gasping, soaked, 30 meters clear of the span and as far as Voss could tell in the blackness, still unseen. She lay flat a moment, Draeth's ragged breath loud against her collarbone, and behind them, faint, she heard the bored sentry's footsteps still pacing their unbroken loop, oblivious. "You did that," Draeth murmured, barely audible. "Very well for someone with no training in it at all." "Yeah, well." Voss got her arms back under the Osran's weight, feeling every abused muscle in her body register a complaint she didn't have the luxury of listening to. Add it to the report. They were up and moving again inside 30 seconds, because 30 seconds was all either of them could spare, and behind them the outpost sentries kept walking their bored, unbroken loop, never once aware of what had passed 20 meters beneath their boots. At the Amber Line's command post, the tension that had been building for the better part of an hour finally found a shape. "War Mother." Farron looked up from the comm relay, and this time there was no careful neutrality left in her voice at all. Signals Intelligence flagged a Dominion patrol vehicle on the southern approach track, moving east. If it holds its heading, it crosses Voss's projected route within the next 12 minutes. Kesala's hands, braced flat against the edges of the tactical table, did not move. Projected route, not confirmed position. Confirmed position is exactly what we do not have, War Mother. The signal keeps dropping. Orin had crossed back to the table at the first mention of the patrol vehicle, and this time she did not wait to be invited into the conversation. "War Mother, if you send a forward element past the western gate to intercept that patrol's line before it reaches theirs, you are not merely bending the triage doctrine. You are committing armed personnel into contested ground on the strength of a marker that keeps failing to resolve. If that element makes contact, this is no longer a quiet exception the War Council reviews at its leisure. This is a battalion commander starting an engagement to retrieve a corporal who is already, technically, absent without leave. I am aware of the distinction, Orin. Then you are aware it is the distinction that will end your command, if it goes wrong." Kesala straightened, and for a moment the tent was silent but for the low hum of the display and the distant, ordinary sounds of a perimeter settling into its evening watch. She thought again of the photograph she had not thought about in 11 years until tonight, a Wayfinder she had never met, left on a border world by an officer who had, she did not doubt, agonized over the decision exactly as she was agonizing now, and had made the safe choice, and had gone on, presumably, to sleep at night. "Small element," she said finally. "2 scouts, forward observation only, no engagement authority. They hold at the tree line and report. If the patrol vehicle crosses toward our people, I want warning enough to decide what happens next. I do not want a battalion committed to a fight nobody chose. Is that a distinction you can live with, Oren?" Oren held her gaze a long moment, and something in her posture eased, fractionally, the argument of a subordinate who had said what duty required her to say and had been heard, if not obeyed to the letter. "It is a distinction I can carry to the War Council without embarrassing either of us, War Mother. I will see it done myself." "Good." Kassala turned back to the flickering marker, alone again in the particular way command always left a person alone, no matter how crowded the tent. "And Oren, thank you for saying it plainly. I would rather be argued with than agreed with tonight." Oren's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, and she was gone toward the gate before Kassala could see whether it had become one. The last kilometer was the worst of all of them, not because the ground was harder. If anything, the scrub gave way, gradually, to the more solid footing of the approach corridor the Concord's own engineers had cleared months ago. But because Voss's body had nothing left to give and kept giving it anyway, each stride a negotiation her legs lost and took again a half-second later out of sheer refusal to stop. Draeth had gone quiet again, not unconscious this time but conserving something. Her breath a thin, effortful whisper against Voss's collarbone, her weight, impossibly, terribly, feeling heavier with every 100 meters instead of lighter. The way exhaustion made everything heavier the longer you carried it. "Talk to me," Voss said, when the silence had stretched too long to bear. "Say something, anything." "I am tired, Corporal." It came out almost gentle, almost amused, the dry humor surfacing one last time from somewhere Voss hadn't known a dying woman could still reach. "Give me something to say and I will say it." "The wing strut, will it heal?" "With conquered field surgery cleanly in 6 weeks, I have broken worse." A pause, breath rattling faintly. "Assuming the rest of me survives long enough to need the 6 weeks." "It will." "You cannot promise that." "I'm not promising it. I'm deciding it." Voss's voice came out rougher than she meant it to, scraped raw by exhaustion and cold, and a fear she had been outrunning for 3 hours now and could feel finally starting to catch up. "You don't get to be a statistic tonight. Not after everything it took to get you this far. I refuse the math." Draeth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something smaller, stripped of the dry humor, stripped of the caste-bred fatalism she'd worn like armor all night. "No one has ever refused a math on my behalf before," she said. "Not once, not in 11 years. "Well," Voss adjusted her grip, feeling her own arms shake with a tremor that had stopped being about muscle fatigue somewhere back at the minefield, and had become, instead, something closer to grief held at bay by motion alone. First time for everything. Ahead, through the last thin scrim of reeds, lights. Not the harsh sweeping white of an Ashkarite scout beam, but the steady amber glow of conquered perimeter lamps, strung along a defensive line Voss had crossed 100 times in daylight, and had never, in 4 campaigns, been so grateful to see. "There," she said, and something in her chest, some last reserve she hadn't known she was holding back, broke loose, and she found one final surge of speed in legs that had nothing left, carrying Draeth the last 200 meters at something close to a run. The Amber Line's western gate was not where Voss expected trouble to find her, but it was where it found her anyway, in the form of a challenge shouted from the perimeter watch the instant her silhouette broke the tree line. A challenge that cut off half a syllable into itself when the watch officer's beam swept across her, and found not an enemy scout but a mud-soaked human corporal carrying a wounded Osran Wayfinder in her arms, both of them barely upright, both of them very clearly, impossibly alive. "Medical!" The shout went up and down the line in a ragged chain, and then there were hands, careful, urgent Osran medics moving with the trained efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times, lifting Draeth from Voss's arms onto a waiting stretcher with a gentleness that made Voss's knees finally, fully, buckle now that the weight was gone, and her body no longer had a reason to keep pretending it could stand. She didn't fall far. Someone caught her. Cho, she realized dimly. Cho's face streaked with mud and tears and something fierce that might have been fury or relief or both at once, arms locking around her before she hit the ground. "You absolute idiot," Cho said, voice cracking. "You absolute insubordinate." "She's alive," Voss managed. "Cho. She's alive. I can see that. I can also see you look like something the Delta chewed up and spat out." But Cho was crying now, openly, holding on tighter than the words suggested she wanted to. "Don't you ever do that to me again." Voss didn't answer, because across the churn of medics and stretcher-bearers and the low, urgent chatter of a trauma team going to work, she'd caught sight of a tall Osran figure standing very still at the gate's edge, watching the stretcher pass with an expression Voss had never once seen on War Mother Thren Kesala's face in 4 campaigns of service under her command. It looked, more than anything, like a woman doing arithmetic that had just stopped balancing the way she'd been taught it would. Kesala's eyes moved from the stretcher to Voss, standing there swaying and filthy and bleeding from a shoulder wound she hadn't reported and clearly wasn't about to. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. They took Draeth into the Amber Lines field surgery under lights bright enough to turn the whole tent white, and Voss was not permitted to follow. Was, instead, marched to a cot in the adjoining medical bay and made to sit, while a young Osran corpsman cleaned and stitched the gash on her arm and pressed a hot ration into her shaking hands, and told her twice, in the gentle firm tone medics used on soldiers who had run out of every reserve except stubbornness, that she needed to eat something before she fell over. She ate, she didn't taste it. Somewhere on the other side of the canvas wall, a surgical team was doing whatever it was going to do with Draeth's collapsed lung strut and the wound at her ribs that had bled silver blue into the marsh water for 3 hours, and Voss sat with her hands wrapped around a cooling ration cup and listened to the murmur of voices. She couldn't make out and understood, distantly, that there was nothing more her body could do now except wait. Kesala found her there an hour later. The War Mother came alone, without her aide, without the retinue that usually trailed a battalion commander even inside a secured perimeter. And she did not sit, but she did stand close enough that Voss had to look up to meet her eyes, which felt, after 4 months under her command, like an act of deliberate exposure on the older woman's part rather than an accident of height. "Corporal Voss." Kesala's voice carried none of the flat command post authority Voss had heard across a dozen briefings. It sounded, instead, almost careful. "You disobeyed a direct triage order." "Yes, War Mother." "You are aware of the standard consequence for that." "Yes, War Mother." "Good." Kesala's jaw worked once, a small motion, the first crack Voss had ever seen in that composed, doctrinal exterior. "Because I am not certain tonight that I am prepared to apply it, and I would like you to understand that this troubles me a great deal more than it appears to trouble you." Voss set the ration cup down carefully because her hands had started shaking again and she didn't trust them not to spill it. "Ma'am, if it helps, I wasn't trying to prove the doctrine wrong. I wasn't thinking about the doctrine at all. I was thinking about a woman who walked a minefield for 11 people 3 weeks ago and never got so much as a formal word of thanks for it, and who was about to die alone in a delta because a number said the math didn't favor her." "The math," Kesala said, "did not favor her. I ran it myself. Column strength, retrieval distance, enemy proximity, time to extraction window. Every input I had said the cost of retrieving Wayfinder Draeth exceeded any reasonable value of her survival to this campaign. Then the math left something out." "Yes," Kesala's voice had gone very quiet. "It left out the fact that Saevi Draeth has served this Concord for 11 years, has been triaged and abandoned twice before tonight by officers who ran the same arithmetic I ran and reached the same conclusion I reached, and that in 11 years, in the entire history of her caste's service to this alliance, no one, not an Osran officer, not a fellow Wayfinder, no one has ever once done what you did tonight. She looked, for the first time since Voss had known her, less like a commander and more like a woman confronting something she had built her career on and finding it hollow. I have signed cutoff orders for Wayfinders before. I understood them each time as a regrettable necessity. I did not understand them until an hour ago, watching a human corporal half drag a dying woman 200 meters into my perimeter on legs that should not have still been working, as a policy that had simply never once been tested against a person who refused to accept it. Voss didn't know what to say to that. She sat with the silence a moment, exhaustion and adrenaline crash making the tense edges swim slightly, and finally settled on the only true thing she had left. She's a person, War Mother, not a number the doctrine gets to spend. No, Kessala said, I am beginning tonight to agree with you. She straightened, and something of the old composure returned to her posture, though not, Voss noted, entirely to her eyes. You will not be court-martialed, Corporal Voss. You will instead write a full account of tonight's action, and you will submit it to me directly, and I will forward it to the War Council with my own assessment attached, an assessment that will, for the first time in my career, recommend the triage doctrine be reviewed for its treatment of Wayfinder personnel specifically. A pause. This does not happen because a rule was broken cleanly enough to look good on paper, Corporal. It happens because you were right and the doctrine was wrong, and I am old enough in this uniform to know the difference matters more than the paperwork. The surgery ran 4 hours. Voss slept for perhaps 40 minutes of it, upright on the cot, and woke each time some sound from the tent next door. A raised voice, an instrument dropped. The particular urgent cadence of a trauma team's rhythm shifting jolted her back into a wakefulness that refused stubbornly to let her rest properly until she knew. Cho sat with her for most of it, saying little, which was its own kind of mercy. Someone had brought a second ration and a dry blanket, and Cho draped it over Voss's shoulders without comment, and for a long while the two of them simply sat with the muffled sounds of the surgery bleeding faintly through canvas, listening to a rhythm neither of them had the training to interpret, and both of them were too afraid to ask about directly. You know, regimental's already asking questions, Cho said eventually, keeping her voice low. Comms picked up your channel breaking off. There's a report queued with your name on it before you even made it back through the wire. I figured. You could have told me before you went. You'd have come with me. Damn right I would have. Cho's jaw tightened, and for a moment the fierceness in her voice cracked into something rower. And then it'd have been 2 of us the War Mother had to write off instead of 1, and Talon Company would be down a corporal and a private instead of just carrying you home a hero. That's not gratitude, Ray. That's math too. You didn't just risk yourself out there. I know. Do you? Cho studied her, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed in the lamplight, and some of the anger went out of her, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. I'm not saying you were wrong. I watched them carry her in. I watched her breathing when I didn't think she'd still be breathing by the time you got back. I'm saying it costs something, and I don't think you've let yourself feel that part yet, because you're still running on whatever got you across that delta. Voss didn't answer right away. Her hands, wrapped around the ration cup, had gone still for the first time in hours, and something in her chest that she'd kept locked down since long before the Ford, if she was honest, pressed up against the back of her throat, and she let it sit there rather than swallow it down again. Ask me tomorrow, she said finally. I'll have an answer by then. Fair enough. Cho nudged her shoulder, gentle now, the anger spent. Why her, though, out of everyone you could have broken an order for? Voss thought about the ridge 3 weeks ago. About 11 soldiers walking off a minefield alive, because one woman had trusted her own training over her own fear. about a caste built to be spent, and a dignity that had survived being spent anyway. Because somebody had to be the one who didn't leave, she said, and I was there. It wasn't a complete answer. Cho seemed to understand it was the only one she had. The corpsman who finally came through the canvas flap near dawn was young, spattered with the dark stains of a long surgery, and visibly, carefully neutral in the particular way medical staff trained themselves to be neutral right up until the moment they weren't required to be anymore. Corporal Voss. The corpsman's composure cracked just slightly into something warmer. Wayfinder Draeth is stable. The strut required full reconstruction. She'll be 6 weeks in recovery minimum, and she'll carry a scar on that side for the rest of her life. But she's stable. She's going to live. Voss's whole body seemed to exhale at once. Some tension she hadn't fully registered carrying finally letting go all through her chest and shoulders and the backs of her knees. And she found, distantly, that her eyes had gone hot and wet in a way she was too tired to be embarrassed about. "Can I see her?" "She's asking for you, actually." First thing she said when she came back up from the anesthetic, wanted to know if the human corporal made it back inside the wire in one piece. The corpsman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "I told her you'd been sitting out here the whole time." She said that sounded like something you'd do. The recovery tent smelled of antiseptic and the particular mineral tang of Osron field medicine, and Draeth lay beneath a thin thermal blanket with her wounded side wrapped in fresh dressing, an IV line running clear fluid into the crook of her arm, her pale gold eyes open and tired but clearer, Voss thought, than they'd been at any point during the long walk out of the Delta. "You look terrible," Draeth said, by way of greeting, and this time the dry humor made it all the way through without a cough behind it. "You should see yourself." "I have declined the mirror. I suspect I would not enjoy it." Draeth's good hand shifted on the blanket, an invitation Voss recognized and took, settling into the low stool beside the cot, feeling, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, that she could finally stop bracing for the next crisis. "The War Mother came to see me an hour ago, before you woke." "Yeah." She apologized. Draeth said it carefully, as if the word itself was a strange shape in her mouth. "Not for the doctrine, she says, will be reviewed properly by the War Council in time, and she does not believe in apologizing for decisions that were correct by the standards that existed when she made them. But she apologized for never, in 11 years of my service, having asked what those standards cost the people they were applied to." A breath, steady now, no longer effortful. "I have been triaged twice before tonight, Corporal Voss, left both times by officers who believed sincerely that they were being merciful, sparing a column, sparing further loss, sparing me a slow death instead of a fast one. I told myself both times that this was simply the shape of being a wayfinder. I did not expect, at 11 years into that shape, to have it broken." "Do you have family?" Voss asked before she'd fully decided to ask it. "Somewhere back on Osron Prime, people who'd have, I don't know, grieved. If tonight had gone the other way." Draeth was quiet a moment, her gold eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the tent's canvas ceiling. "Wayfinders are creche-raised, taken from the birthing collective at a very young age and trained separately together, a cohort, not a family, though we called each other siblings when the instructors weren't listening, because we needed some word for what we were to one another, and the conquered had not given us one. I had 11 siblings in my cohort. 4 remain living. The rest were spent well, as the saying goes." She said it without visible bitterness, though something in the flat delivery told Voss the absence of bitterness had cost her something to maintain over the years. "I do not have a mother who would grieve me by your meaning of the word, Corporal. I have 4 siblings scattered across 3 fronts who would receive a notice in time, and would understand it exactly as I understood the notices for the other 7. It is not tragedy in our accounting. It is simply how the ledger closes." "That's a hell of a ledger." "It is the only one I was given." Draeth turned her head then, meeting Voss's eyes directly. "Which is, I think, why tonight sits so strangely with me. You did not know my cohort. You are not bound to me by creche or blood or any accounting my culture recognizes as owed. And yet you spent your own body, your own standing, very nearly your own life, closing a ledger that was never yours to close." A breath, careful, unhurried now that the urgency of the delta had drained out of her voice. "I do not yet know what to do with that. I suspect I will be turning it over for some time. I didn't break anything. I just walked back into the delta." "You walked back into the delta," Draeth said. "Against a direct order, through a contested field, across a channel that should have drowned us both, past a Dominion patrol close enough to touch, carrying a person your own doctrine had already written off because you decided, alone, in the space of about 11 seconds by Private Cho's account of it, that the math was wrong. That is not nothing, Corporal. In my culture, in my caste's entire history, that is close to unprecedented." Voss looked down at her own hands, scraped raw, bruised across the knuckles from 3 hours of bracing against reeds and current and broken concrete, and thought about how small the decision had actually felt in the moment. Not heroic, not calculated, just the only thing that had made sense once she'd heard Draeth's name attached to that word. "You'd have done the same," she said, "for me or for anyone." "I do not know that I would have," Draeth said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the flat honesty Voss had come to recognize as entirely her own. "I was bred and trained to accept the math, Corporal, not to defy it. Perhaps I would have found the courage. I would like to believe I would have. But I am glad tonight that I did not have to find out, that instead I got to be the one the math was wrong about, for once, instead of the one who has to be the exception herself." They sat with that a while, the tent quiet around them but for the distant hum of the medical bay's generators, and, somewhere farther off, the ordinary sounds of an army settling into the pause between one engagement and the next, voices, boots, the clatter of a supply crate being unloaded, life continuing on the far side of a night that had nearly ended 2 of theirs. "There's something I want to give you," Draeth said eventually, and with visible effort reached with her uninjured hand to the small table beside the cot, where a conquered orderly had set the few personal effects recovered from her field kit. Among them, a length of woven cord, gray-green, worn smooth with years of handling, threaded through a small brass fitting shaped like a compass rose with too many points for a human instrument. A Wayfinder's cord. Every one of us is given one at the end of creche training. It is meant to mark a path back. If the ground ever turns against you, you tie it to the last solid thing you trust and follow it home. She pressed it into Voss's palm, closing the human woman's scraped fingers around it with her own. "I have never given mine to anyone. It is not tradition to do so. But I find tonight that I would like you to have it, not because you need it to find your way, Corporal. Because I would like you to remember that once, in a delta on Havern's Reach, you were the last solid thing a dying woman trusted, and you were right to be trusted." Voss's throat closed around whatever she'd meant to say. She closed her hand around the cord instead, feeling its worn, warm weight, and said the only thing that felt true enough to hold the moment. "I'll keep it." "I know you will," Draeth said. "That is rather the point." The war did not stop for either of them. Not really. 3 days later Talon Company was back on the line. The Ashkarite dominions push along the Greywater Delta blunted but not broken. The frontier still a frontier. The amber line still a line that would need holding for weeks or months to come. Voss's written account of the night went, as promised, to the War Council along with War Mother Kesala's own assessment. And whatever slow machinery governed doctrine review in a matriarchal alliance, 11 decades old began, somewhere far above Voss's rank and pay grade, to turn. She didn't think much about that part. What she thought about, in the weeks that followed, was smaller and closer than doctrine, was Cho's face when she'd caught her at the gate, Was the particular weight of a woman's trust settled into your arms across 4 kilometers of ground that belonged to no one? Was Draeth, 6 weeks into a recovery the corpsman had promised and delivering on it exactly as forecast, walking the amber line's perimeter on a wing strut still stiff with new growth, upright, difficult, exactly as Voss had asked her to be? The board convened 11 days after the Delta crossing, in a requisition briefing tent 3 kilometers behind the amber line, and Voss stood at attention in a fresh uniform that still smelled faintly of the quartermaster's stores, while 3 Osran officers she had never met read her written account from printed pages, in silence, for what felt like considerably longer than the account itself had taken to live through. The senior of the 3, a broad-shouldered war council liaison named Fessa Orun, looked up first. "Corporal Voss, your account states that you made the decision to disregard the triage cutoff within, and I quote your own words, about 11 seconds. Is that an accurate figure or a figure of speech?" "Accurate, ma'am. Best I can reconstruct it. 11 seconds to override a doctrine 11 years in the writing." Orun set the pages down, unhurried, and studied Voss with an expression that gave away nothing at all, the particular flat unreadability Voss had learned over 4 campaigns to associate with Osran officers holding judgment in reserve rather than absent. "Talk me through those 11 seconds, Corporal. Not the Delta, not the crossing, the decision itself." Voss had rehearsed an answer for this, lying awake the last 3 nights in the recovery ward with her arm in a sling, and found, standing in front of 3 officers with her service record laid open on the table between them, that the rehearsed version wasn't the true one. "I didn't decide anything, ma'am. Not the way the word usually means it. I heard Wayfinder Draeth's name and the word unsalvageable in the same sentence, and my body was already moving before the rest of me caught up to argue about it. If you're asking whether I weighed the court-martial against the alternative and made a considered choice, no. I'd be lying if I said that's what happened. What happened is I'd watched that woman walk 11 of us off a minefield 3 weeks earlier, and never once heard her name said with a thank you attached to it, and something in me wasn't willing to let the last thing she heard from this army be a number." A second officer, younger, silent until now, leaned forward. "That is not a defense that holds up well under military law, Corporal." "No, sir, it isn't. I'm not offering it as a defense. You asked what happened in 11 seconds. That's what happened." Orun exchanged a glance with the officer beside her that Voss couldn't read, and let the silence sit a moment before she spoke again. "War Mother Kesala's assessment, attached to your account, recommends against disciplinary action and in favor of doctrine review. That recommendation carries considerable weight with this board, more, I will tell you honestly, than is entirely comfortable for those of us who spent our careers inside the doctrine she is now asking us to reconsider." She gathered the pages, squared them once against the table, a small, precise gesture that Voss suspected meant more than it looked like it did. "This board finds no grounds for court-martial. Your record will reflect a formal reprimand for disregarding a direct order, and will also reflect, at the War Mother's insistence, a commendation for conduct that the reprimand does not, in this board's judgment, come close to outweighing." A pause, and something almost human moved behind the flat Osran composure. "For what it is worth, Corporal, this board has read a great many accounts of soldiers who followed every order correctly and lost the thing the order was meant to protect. Yours is the first in some years that made me glad to read it twice." "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me." Orun stood, and the other 2 rose with her, the hearing closing with the same unhurried formality it had opened with. "Thank the Doctrine Review Committee in about 6 months if they have the courage to finish what you started in a Delta with no orders and no backup. Dismissed, Corporal." Voss walked out of the briefing tent into the bright, ordinary light of a midday she had genuinely not been certain, 11 days earlier, that she would live to see, and found Cho waiting exactly where she said she would be, arms crossed, doing a poor job of pretending she hadn't been worried. Well, reprimand and a commendation, Voss said. Apparently those can happen in the same sentence now. Sounds about right for you, Cho said, and fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything else about it, because there wasn't really anything else that needed saying. The doctrine review reached Talon Company in the ordinary, unglamorous way most policy did, not as an announcement, but as a line item in a briefing packet nobody read closely until the second week of the new campaign season, when a young Osran Wayfinder named Corporal Reya took a mortar fragment through the thigh during a forward reconnaissance run, and command, instead of running the old triage arithmetic against her, dispatched a retrieval team inside the hour. Voss heard about it secondhand from Cho, who'd heard it from the medics Vale walking into the field hospital under her own power 2 days later, indignant that anyone had thought her worth the fuss, and one of the older Osran corpsmen telling her flatly that fuss was the new standard now, whether she liked it or not. Voss found Draeth at the fence that evening and told her about it, and watched something move behind the Wayfinder's gold eyes that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere uneasily between the two, the particular expression of a woman watching a door open that had been locked her entire life. For someone else, one campaign season too late to have opened it for the 7 siblings whose notices she still kept, folded, in the bottom of her field kit. She will not understand, for some time, what was different about how she was retrieved, Draeth said. That is as it should be. The best doctrine is the kind no one has to notice working. You noticed? I noticed because I lived on the wrong side of it for 11 years, Corporal. Corporal Reya will simply grow up believing this was always how it was done, and in a generation, if the War Council holds the line on it, that will be true. That is what change like this is meant to look like, in the end, not a monument. A thing so ordinary that no one thinks to be grateful for it. They found each other, most evenings, at the same stretch of the perimeter fence, where the Delta's reeds were visible in the middle distance, gone gold now instead of green-black as the season turned. Draeth had taken, in the weeks of her convalescence, to teaching Voss the rudiments of ground reading, not enough to make her a wayfinder, nothing so grand as that, but enough that she no longer walked contested terrain entirely blind, enough that once, on a routine patrol a month after the Delta crossing, she caught the wrongness in a stretch of grass herself, a half-second before anyone told her to, and stopped the whole squad cold in front of a mine none of the scans had flagged. You are learning, Draeth told her that evening at the fence, with something that was almost pride in her voice. I had a good teacher. You had a teacher who owed you a debt she will spend the rest of her life failing to repay. Draeth's hand found the fence rail beside Voss's, not quite touching, the particular careful distance of 2 people who had shared something too large for easy names. The War Council issued its review yesterday. Did the War Mother tell you? No. Wayfinder triage classification is amended, effective next campaign season. Retrieval priority raised to match standard personnel, contingent on tactical feasibility rather than caste designation alone. Draeth said it plainly, without triumph, though something underneath the words carried more weight than the flat delivery let on. 11 years of doctrine, Corporal. Changed because one human corporal decided a number was wrong, and was too stubborn to let the number win. Voss looked out at the Delta, gold-green in the evening light, quiet now in a way it had not been quiet the night she'd carried a dying woman across it, and thought about how strange it was that the loudest, most consequential thing she had ever done in this war had required no speech, no argument, no case made to any war council, only a body that kept walking long after it had run out of reasons to, and a decision made once cleanly, in 11 seconds, that she had never once had to make twice. They called you a lost cause, she said, before I even got there. That's the last thing I heard on comms. They did. Draeth's gold eyes, steady now, found hers in the fading light. I have decided I do not mind the phrase so much any more, Corporal Voss. A lost cause is only lost until someone goes back for it. Voss huffed something that was almost a laugh, tired and warm and entirely without irony, and closed her hand once more around the worn cord she still carried, every day, in the breast pocket nearest her heart. "Yeah," she said, watching the last light go down gold over the delta that had nearly taken them both. "Guess it is." They stood at the fence a while longer, in the particular quiet of two soldiers who had earned the right to say nothing at all, while behind them the amber line settled into its evening watch, and ahead of them the reeds bent gently in a wind that no longer carried the sound of guns, and somewhere in the growing dark a war that would go on without either of them noticing, for one held moment, that the math had been wrong, and had been made right the only way it ever really is, by someone refusing, simply and completely, to let it stand.